I'm a university lecturer over in Finland, but I was also a postdoc at Maastricht University in the Netherlands, and some of this work was carried out there. So I will be talking about memory experiences under psychedelic, or autobiographical experiences under psychedelics, you could also say. So whenever I go back to the early LSD research of the 50s and 60s, one of the things that I'm struck with is what a big role memory experiences have in these descriptions of the effects of LSD. For example, in the very first English language paper on the therapeutic use of LSD, Anthony Bush and Warren Johnson wrote that the effect disturbed the barrier of repression and permitted a re-examination of significant experiences of the past, which sometimes were relived with frightening realism. So in the very first paper, talking about the effects of LSD, this is one of the main effects that they point out. And this is repeated throughout many different countries and many different contexts in the early LSD research. For example, Chandler and Hartman write, based on 700 sessions with LSD, it is very common for early childhood memories that have been repressed or forgotten to emerge, usually with great clarity of recall. Reliving describes the more intense experiences better than the term recall. These sort of experiences were particularly prominent and talked a lot about in the psycholytic therapy approach. So this is the approach where psychedelics were used repeatedly, dozens of times sometimes, somewhat smaller doses, although a small dose in this case often meant 100 micrograms of LSD, so not microdoses. And for example, the sort of biggest name of psycholytic therapy in continental Europe, Hans-Karl Leuner, wrote that the subjects report childhood scenes that appear to unfold like a film strip and are experienced with the eyes and emotions appropriate for a child of that age. So reliving to the point of age regression. Over here in Britain, there was a large LSD research program, clinical program at Powik Hospital, and medical superintendent Spencer writes in this paper, actually describing a very unique, interesting group therapy approach. I really recommend reading the paper. But he writes that not only did LSD enable unconscious memories to be recovered easily, but their being relived was extremely realistic to the patient, frequently accompanied by changes in the body image, so that the patient felt he was of the physical size and age he had been when the traumatic experience occurred. So specifically talking about traumatic experiences emerging. The most famous practitioner at Powik was Ronald Sandison, and he makes this very specific and strong claim in this article with Whitelaw that LSD is the only drug which will bring sexual trauma in childhood that has been repressed into consciousness. Quite a strong and controversial claim, we would say, at least today. And not only were these authors talking about early experiences, but they were talking about really, really early experiences. For example, Chandler and Hartman write that several patients have checked with parents concerning incidents or details such as household furnishing with striking confirmation, considering that some of the memories dated back as early as the first year of life. We have this from several authors claiming that not only do we have memory experiences of the first year, but they could be confirmed. Going even further, what about the birth? Obviously, Stanislav Grof was quite famous for the fact that he took birth experiences to be a very central feature of his theorizing and understanding of what happens under LSD. And sometimes he's talking more figuratively, but sometimes very concretely. And he does make this claim: the subjects can relive various aspects of their biological birth with specific and verifiable details. He says that, and he's not the only one. For instance, Frank Lake, the founder of clinical theology, wrote that first he noticed that patients would return for this abreactive remembering of the very first year of life, but what he was not prepared for was the frequent abreaction of birth trauma. And he claims that a number of cases emerge in which the reliving of specific birth injuries was so vivid, unmistakable in the origin, and afterwards confirmed by the mother or other reliable information that my skepticism was shaken. Okay, so let's address this straight on. What we know and understand from modern memory research suggests this should not be possible, right? There is the phenomenon of childhood amnesia, which means that we have very few memories from the first years of our lives, and it is total for the first year of life, at least for the vast majority of people. It's debatable whether there can be some rare exceptions, but at least for the very, very vast majority of people, there are no memories from the first year of life. There's nothing to be recovered from there because they were not encoded in the way that episodic autobiographical memories are. For several reasons. The hippocampus is not developed, the sense of self and identity is not developed, language is not there. and so on. Considering this focus and interest in memory experiences or autobiographical experiences in the early literature, early research, it's really quite striking how limited the focus has been in more recent research. There's a lot more focus on these mystical type experiences and very non-personal events and so on. But we do have some notes here and there, especially in the qualitative research, about these types of experiences, people having them. For instance, in this paper by Rosalind Watson colleagues, they write about patients in a psilocybin trial that some of the most powerful experiences were moments when past traumas were apparently revisited, and drug experiences were often interspersed with memories of love as well as trauma, which provided much needed relief and sustenance. So some patients were having important memory experiences both of trauma but also of love. Another example is a paper by Deborah Gonzalez and colleagues on people taking ayahuasca during their grief process. And they write that about more than a quarter of their participants refer to having re-experienced biographical memories, some of them re-experiencing death-related events, but others referring to long-forgotten events involving the deceased or reviewing their personal history to arrive at new meanings for their own life story. We did a little study a few years back on the very first psychedelic experiences of people in Finland. We were focused on the mystical side, as so many others were, but we did get some descriptions of these sort of memory experiences as well. For example, I was able to scroll through my memories from different types of menus with a kind of 3D operating system. I saw terrible scenes from my childhood that until then were shrouded in darkness or I did not remember them. So people are having these experiences, even the very first time they take a psychedelic, even in Finland, apparently. But clearly, this seemed to be much, much more prevalent and much more discussed in the early literature. Why is that? There is an elephant in the room, which is psychoanalysis. Obviously, practically all of these early authors were psychoanalytically trained psychiatrists who were very, very intensely interested in childhood trauma, in repressed memories, recovering memories as a source of psychological suffering and so on. So it's not hard to imagine that they were looking for these experiences, perhaps priming in some way and really focusing on them. But even so, looking back at this early research, there are some quite specific and interesting claims here that have been a sort of inspiration for why I think we should focus more on memory experiences in the here and now as well. So for one, there's this claim that LSD and by extension other psychedelics, they allow for particularly vivid, clear, first-person intense recall of autobiographical memories, up to the point of feeling like reliving or age regression. And a somewhat separate point, the claim is that LSD allows for easier access to early memories or access to memories that would otherwise be inaccessible, repressed, forgotten. It should be mentioned that the whole concept of recovered memories is contentious and complex in modern memory research, and we can go into that later. And there is a third claim, especially in the psycholytic therapy framework, that recalling and processing these memories and the associated emotional release or catharsis or abreaction would be highly therapeutic. It would be one of the unique therapeutic components in this sort of treatment. So reflecting on these sorts of claims and the fact that there's so little modern research, we recently wrote this little commentary/review with Morten Leeds on questions that we should ask about psychedelics and autobiographical memory that are still open and that we think are important both for therapeutic use of psychedelics and for avoiding harms. And for the rest of this talk, I'll focus a little bit on each of these questions. But I will also present some findings. We did run the autopsy, or autopsy, if you prefer, study recently. So a memory specifically focusing on autobiographical memory and psychedelics. Now this was an observational study, an exploratory study on memory experiences during naturalistic psychedelic use. So we recruited English-speaking adults from different countries who were planning to take a psychedelic on their own in whatever context, so not controlled research. We got about 200 people to sign up and complete baseline measurements, and about 70 people who provided data straight after the experience in the next few days, and then about a month later. This is a small sample, obviously, compared to a lot of cross-sectional research. You can easily get hundreds of people to answer once, but to retain them for months is a lot harder. But it is somewhat larger than your small clinical trials might be. And these were 2/3 men, mean age 35, from many different countries. most commonly Finland, that's where I'm from, also the Netherlands and Germany, some people from the UK as well. Well educated, most of them experienced psychedelic users, but not all of them. About half taking psilocybin, others LSD or LSD analogs or ayahuasca. Doses were typically moderate or large. And in very, very different types of contexts and with different intentions and so on. So this is really a sample of naturalistic use out there in the real world. So the first question we presented in this commentary is, do psychedelics actually enhance autobiographical recall? And as we saw, there's two different sides of this. Do they enhance it in the sense of subjective experience? Do we experience memories more vividly? Do we relive them more? Or do they actually provide some easier access or access to memories that would otherwise be inaccessible? And we saw that there's strong claims in the early LSD research that this is the case. And I'm sure we've all heard lots of anecdotes about this. People really remembering life events strongly or recovering memories and so on. This is quite interesting because on the other hand, somewhat paradoxically, psychedelics impair performance in memory tasks. Psychedelics generally make your memory worse. If you actually give people psychedelics and then test them in the laboratory, they'll do worse than they'll do sober, not better. And people have experiences of amnesia. You can take psychedelics and not have any memories of who you are at all. You can be completely amnesic to your past and your identity. There could be many explanations here, of course. Dose is the obvious answer here. Perhaps smaller doses enhance, larger doses impair memory, and so on, or different substances and context and so on. If we think about the subjective experience, there really has been only one controlled study on this, but that study did show that psilocybin increased phenomenal intensity of autobiographical memories. So they were experienced as more vivid and more emotionally intense and so on than under placebo. We did try to look at this a couple of ways in our study. First of all, we simply asked people, did you find it easier or more difficult than usual to access memories during your experience? The answer is yes and no. Some people found it easier, some people a lot harder. So clearly these experiences vary a lot, tremendously. But towards the end of the experience, the sort of median tends toward easier access. But otherwise, the main finding here is that some people found it much, much easier, some much more difficult. Total amnesia was fairly rare, but reported by some people here and there. And some more people reported difficulties remembering their past. So really, there's very, very wide variance in how easy people find it to remember memories and how much memories featured in experiences. But almost all people did report that memories were a part of their experience in one way or another. Here's a few examples. One participant said that memories came to my mind much more easily than normal. I also understood how to handle them. Another said I had heightened ability to recall events but could not do so manually. On the other hand, one person said my memory wasn't significantly affected. Another that I felt I was completely disattached from myself, therefore I didn't have any memories connected to my personal life. Very, very opposite experiences. As regards the subjective experience, we have some examples here, such as that the somatic reaction from my body to negative memories was much stronger than usual, and that I could visualize the event or experience and connect it to how it affected me emotionally. So the second question we presented was whether recall and processing of significant autobiographical memories, such as traumatic memories, is a common part of psychedelic experience. Does this happen a lot? Is it something that happens constantly when people take psychedelics? We have a lot of anecdotes about this, but we don't really have sort of any data on whether this is a common thing at all, that people think about memories and process them somehow. The first way we asked about this is ask people to evaluate how much of the time did you spend thinking about or recalling your memories under psychedelics. Of course, probably a pretty difficult thing to estimate, but we can probably see something from this sort of median of the share of time. At least we see that it tends to happen a little bit more perhaps during the peak and the end of the experience. Most of the experience for most people is spent on other things, obviously, so this is a minority of it, but still a significant part, about 25% of the time. Perhaps more interestingly, we then had a long list of different types of memories and asked people, did you recall these different types of memories? And here are shares of people who recall different types of memories at least once under the psychedelic. So most common we see memories from the last year or many years ago. Childhood memories also above 50%. The earliest memories, actually fairly rare. The birth memories, exceedingly rare. We did have a couple of people who, when we directly asked them, did you remember a memory of your birth? A couple of people said yes, but the majority did not. So in terms of the traumatic memories, before they took the psychedelic, we gave them a list of different possible potentially traumatic events and had them check which ones they've had. And then afterwards we asked, did you think about this or that or that? So about 44% of those who had said that they had at least one potentially traumatic event did think about it during their psychedelic experience. So I think that's quite a high percentage, considering this was not therapy for most people. It was very different contexts and situations. And 14% said that they recalled their potentially traumatic event so strongly as if to be reliving it. So quite a few people. And also relevant to this question, maybe they usually avoided memories. So quite a lot of people, almost 40%, reported that they thought about memories that they usually avoid. A few examples of this. I recalled a painful memory on purpose, probably the biggest trauma of my life. I cried a lot, was happy to have that release of emotion. The experience was intense, but it felt healthy and right. I recalled the moment a horse I was very close to died. I wept like I never have before in my life, and it felt so healthy and comforting to weep and let go. On the other hand, at the onset of the peak, I was flooded with very recent memories showing me how much love there is around me. So a very different type of memory experience. This last one I find kind of interesting. I kept trying to go back into my memories so that I could try to address the trauma, but I had absolutely no interest in doing so. The shimmering walls and the reverberating beats were just too fascinating to be able to focus on anything else. So sometimes perhaps the intentions and the experience don't match in the end. Okay, the third question we presented was whether psychedelics promote the development of false or inaccurate memories. This is quite a significant concern that I have. I'm a researcher in trauma and PTSD by background before I came into psychedelics. We do have some reason to suspect that this might be the case. Why? First of all, other psychoactive drugs have been shown to increase susceptibility to false memories. This has been shown for cannabis, for example. You are more susceptible to developing false memories under cannabis. Psychedelics specifically have quite a few different qualities that could potentially increase development of false memories. They enhance suggestibility, sense of salience, significance, familiarity, certainty of knowing. Whatever you experience under psychedelics will probably feel fairly real to you and very important, salient. And this could, could potentially lead to development of false memories. Certainly concerns have been raised about patients and participants recalling possible traumatic experiences and then being unsure of the veracity of these memories. So there are examples in the published literature, for example, here, but many, many more anecdotes. If you read something like the ayahuasca subreddit, you will read experience after experience about people going to ceremonies and uncovering trauma that they never knew existed and then being conflicted about whether it's true or not and struggling with that. And in some circles, at least, of ayahuasca practice, this sort of belief seems to have developed that ayahuasca specifically is a useful tool for recovering traumatic memories. Quite a problematic situation. However, there is one single study that actually used a false memory paradigm, and they did not find that ayahuasca would increase susceptibility to false memories, and in fact, it improved memory accuracy. This was done by Manoj Dos and colleagues at Maastricht University. But I should note that these were Santo Daime members, so people with 500 sessions of ayahuasca before this particular case. So they are probably very, very used to the state and its effects and so on. So it should be replicated in other people. Relevant to this question, we didn't have a false memory paradigm in this study, but we did ask about, did people remember memories that they had been unable to recall for a long time, so potentially in some sense recovered memories that they had never recalled before, so completely new memories. And memories of events that they themselves do not think they've experienced. So memories they think are not, memories of actual events in their life. And we saw quite a few people reporting this. About a third sort of recovered memories, and more than a quarter memories that they had never recalled before. So quite high numbers, I think. Of course, you can interpret the question in many ways, so we can't exactly know what these participants were thinking. Now, memories that we might be inclined to strongly think are in some sense false memories, birth memories or memories of past lives, were also reported, but were pretty rare, as we can see. I will not focus on questions 4 and 5 here, but I do think they are very worthwhile and worth investigating, and I am investigating them in my current research and in the future. Question 4 is, how do memories change if they are recalled and reconsolidated under psychedelics? So whenever we retrieve a memory, it becomes open to change. New elements can be involved in it, its meaning and tone and everything can change. If this happens while you're on LSD, it could change in some very interesting ways, right? And then that memory will be changed later on as well. But we really don't have any research on this. How do memories change when we process them on psychedelics? And what are memories of psychedelic experiences like? We've studied psychedelic experiences in many different ways, but we have not studied them as memories using the tools of memory research, which I think is quite notable. Psychedelic experiences are often memorable, but they're not necessarily well remembered, and we don't really know how they're remembered and what kind of memories they are, and what does that mean for integration work, for instance? How do they change as memories as we integrate them, and how does that affect our long-term well-being? But the sixth and final question is whether autobiographical experiences under psychedelics would be important for the therapeutic effects as has been claimed. Here I will simply show a few findings that we got from this study. First of all, we did not see a direct association between time spent recalling memories or particular types of memory experiences with changes in long-term well-being. So we assessed this before and 1 month later, and there was no association. But it should be said that people didn't have any big changes in their well-being overall. This was not therapy, and they were not particularly distressed people to begin with. But what we did see is associations between memory experiences and processes that we might think are therapeutic in different ways. So the time spent recalling memories was associated with more emotional breakthroughs, which was evaluated at the same time, just after the experience. Perhaps more interestingly, when we asked them a month later about whether they've gained psychological insights and how meaningful the experience was, again, this was associated with spending more time with memories during the experience. More insights, more meaningful the experience. Out of the specific types of memories, recalling potentially traumatic events was associated with more emotional breakthroughs. Recalling totally new memories, also associated with more emotional breakthroughs, more psychological insights, and ego dissolution. This makes me think perhaps people, when we ask them, did you have a memory, completely new memory, maybe they're thinking about some very unusual experience, right, as a sort of memory, if this is associated with ego dissolution as well. Perhaps most notably, recalling avoided memories had several interesting associations with more emotional breakthroughs, with more psychological insights, and more useful and meaningful experiences. So I think this in particular suggests that going into some things that are avoided under psychedelics could lead to therapeutic benefits. So, can you really remember your birth on LSD? Well, you can certainly feel like or believe that you're remembering or reliving your birth on LSD. You can have a memory experience of your birth on LSD, absolutely. Although, based on this data, it's probably pretty rare without priming or particular expectations. So if you're having an LSD session with Stan Groff or a Rankian birth trauma expert, I would not be surprised if you have this sort of experience. But apart from that, I wouldn't worry about it too much. We do not have evidence to suggest, and we don't really have a reasonable explanation how this could mean the retrieval of an autobiographical memory actually encoded at the time of birth. Of course, it's possible that our current theorizing and understanding of how memory works is false, and we're completely off. But if we're not, if we generally know more or less how memory works, then these are not cases of retrieving a memory that was encoded at the time of birth. All memory is a reconstruction, but this is very much a reconstruction, and it's not based on an actual episodic memory from birth. However, aside from birth memories, people do report a very big variety of fascinating memory experiences under psychedelics, as we saw here. Many different types of experience. Maybe we can switch over. See back? Yes. And we had some suggestion here and many, many anecdotes about the fact that experiences like this could be linked with therapeutic processes and outcomes. So therefore, we absolutely should take these experiences much more seriously and really focus on these sort of experiences under psychedelics in future research. And we do also suggest in our paper that perhaps we should provoke them, intentionally in psychedelic-assisted therapy. So a lot of the modern research has focused on turning inward and trying to make people have mystical experiences and all this, but maybe we should either return to the psycholytic approach, something more like that, or combine psychedelics with exposure therapy, life review therapy, other forms of therapy where memories are very intentionally used, or develop completely new forms of psychedelic-assisted memory-based therapies. That's my suggestion. Thank you.